Chapter 10: A Windstorm in the Forests. The mountain winds, like the dew and rain, sunshine and snow, are measured and bestowed with love on the forest to develop their strength and beauty. However restricted the scope of the other forest influences, that of the winds is universal. The snow bends and trims the upper forest every winter. The lightning strikes a single tree here and there, while avalanches mow down thousands at a swoop as a gardener trims out a bed of flowers. But the winds go to every tree, fingering every leaf and branch and furrowed bole. Not one is forgotten. The mountain pine, towering with outstretched arms on the rugged buttresses of the icy peaks, the lowliest and most retiring tenant of the dells. They seek and find them all, caressing them tenderly, bending them in lusty exercise, simulating their growth, plucking off a leaf or a limb as required, or removing an entire tree or grove, now whispering and cooing through the branches like a sleepy child, now roaring like the ocean, the winds blessing the winds with ineffable beauty and harmony as the sure result. After one has seen pines 6 feet in diameter bending like grasses before a mountain gale, and ever and anon some giant falling and with a crash that shakes the hills, it seems astonishing that save the lowest thick-set trees could ever have found a period sufficiently stormless to establish themselves, or once established that they would ever not sooner or later have been blown down. But when the storm is over and we behold the same forests tranquil again, towering fresh and unscathed in erect majesty, and consider what centuries of storms have fallen upon them since they were first planted, hail to break the tender seedlings, lightning to scorch and scatter, snow, winds, and avalanches to crush and overwhelm, while the manifest result of this wild storm culture is the glorious perfection we behold, then faith in nature's forestry is established, and we cease to deplore the violence of her most destructive gales, or of any other storm implements whatsoever. There are two trees in the Sierra forest that are never blown down, so long as they continue in sound health. They are the juniper and the dwarf pine of the summit peaks. Their stiff, crooked roots grip the storm-beaten ledges like the eagle's claws, while their lithe, cord-like branches bend round pliantly, offering but slight holds for winds, however violent. The other alpine conifers, the needle pine, the mountain pine, two-leaved pine, the hemlock spruce, are never thinned out by this agent to any destructive extent, on account of their admirable toughness and closeness of their growth. In general, the same is true of the giants of the lower zones. The kingly sugar pine, towering aloft to a height of more than 200 feet, offers a fine mark to storm winds, but it is not deeply foliaged, and its long horizontal arms swing around compliantly in the blast like tresses of green, fluent algae in a brook, while the silver firs in most places keep their ranks well together in united strength. The yellow or silver pine is more frequently overturned than any other tree on the Sierra, because its leaves and branches form a larger mass in proportion to its height, while in many places it is planted sparsely, leaving open lanes through which storms may enter with full force. Furthermore, because it is disturbed along the lower portion of the range, which was the first to be left bare on the breaking up on the ice sheet at the close of the glacial winter, the soil it is growing upon has been longer exposed to post-glacial weathering, and consequently is in a more crumbling, decayed condition than the fresher soils farther up the range, and therefore offers a less secure anchorage for the roots. While exploring the forest zones of Mount Shasta, I discovered the path of a hurricane strewn with thousands of pines of this species, great and small, had been uprooted or wrenched off by sheer force, making a clean gap like that made by snow avalanche. But hurricanes capable of doing this class of work are rare in the Sierra, and we may have explored the forest from one extremity of the range to the other. We are compelled to believe that they are the most beautiful on the face of the earth. However, we may regard the agents that have made them so. There is always something deeply exciting, not only in the sounds of the winds in the woods, which exert more or less influence over every mind, but in the varied water-like flow as manifested by the movements of the trees, especially those of the conifers. By no other trees are they rendered so extensively and impressively visible, not even by the lordly tropic palms or the tree ferns responsive to the gentlest breeze. The waving of a forest of the giant sequoias is indescribably impressive and sublime, but the pines seem to me the best interpretations of the winds. They are mighty waving goldenrods, ever in tune, singing and writing wind music all their long century lives. Little, however, of this noble tree with tree waving and tree music will you see or hear in the strictly alpine portion of the forest. The burly juniper, whose girth sometimes more than equals its height, is about as rigid as the rocks on which it grows. The slender lash-like sprays of the dwarf pine stream out in wavering ripples. The tallest and the slenderest are far too unyielding to wave even in the heaviest of gales. They only shake in quick, short vibrations. The hemlock spruce, however, and the mountain pine, and some of the tallest thickets of the two-leaved species bow in storms with considerable scope and gracefulness. But it is only in the lower and middle zones that the meeting of wind and wood is to be seen in all its grandeur. One of the most beautiful and exhilarating storms I have ever enjoyed in the Sierra occurred in December 1874, when I happened to be exploring one of the tributary valleys of the Yuba River. The sky and the ground and the trees had been thoroughly rain-washed and were dry again. The day was intensely pure, one of those incomparable bits of California winter, warm and balmy, full of white sparkling sunshine, redolent of all the purest influences of the spring, and at the same time enlivened with one of the most bracing windstorms conceivable. Instead of camping out as I usually do, I then chanced to be stopping at the house of a friend. But when the storm began to sound, I lost no time in pushing out into the woods to enjoy it. For on such occasions, nature has always been something rare to show us, and the danger to life and limb is hardly greater than one would experience crouching deprecatingly beneath a roof. It was still early morning when I found myself fairly adrift. Delicious sunshine came pouring over the hill, lighting the tops of the pines and setting free a stream of summery fragrance that contrasted strangely with the wild tones of the storm. The air was mottled with pine tassels and bright green plumes that went flashing past in the sunlight like birds pursued. But there were not the slightest dustiness, nothing less pure than leaves and ripe pollen, flecks of withered bracken and moss. I heard trees falling for hours at the rate of one every 2 or 3 minutes, some uprooted partly on account of the loose, water-soaked condition of the ground, others broken straight across where some weakness caused by fire had determined the spot. The gestures of the various trees made a delightful study. Young sugar pines, light and feathery as squirrel tails, were bowing almost to the ground, while the grand old patriarchs whose massive boles had been tied in 100 storms waved solemnly above them, their long arching branches streaming fluently on the gale, and every needle thrilling and ringing and shedding off keen lances of light like a diamond. The Douglas spruces, with long sprays drawn out in level tresses and needles massed in a grayish shimmering glow, presented a most striking appearance as they stood in bold relief among the hilltops. The mandanos and the dells, with their red bark and large glossy leaves tilted every way, reflected the sunshine and throbbing spangled like those so often seen on the rippled surface of a glacier lake. But their red bark and large glossy leaves, tilted every way, reflected the sunshine and throbbing spangles, like those so often seas on the rippled surface of a glacier lake. But the silver pines were now the most importantly beautiful of all. Colossal spires, 200 feet in height, waved like supple golden rods, chanting and bowing low as if in worship, while the whole mass of their long, emulous foliage was kindled into one continuous blaze of white sun fire. The force of the gale was so much that the most steadfast monarch of them all rocked down to its roots with a motion plainly perceptible when one leaned against it. Nature was holding high festival, and every fiber of the most rigid giants thrilled with glad excitement. I drifted on through the midst of their passionate music and motion across many a glen from ride to ridge, often halting in the lee of a rock or shelter, or to gaze and listen even when the grand anthem had swelled to its highest pitch. I could distinctly hear the varying tones of individual trees, spruce, fir, and pine, and leafless oak, and even the infinitely gentle rustle of the withered grasses at my feet. Each was expressing itself in its own way, singing its own song, and making its own peculiar gestures, manifesting a richness of variety to be found in no other forest I have yet seen. The coniferous woods of Canada and the Carolinas and Florida are made up of trees that resemble one another almost as much as blades of grass, and grow so closely together in much the same way. Coniferous trees in general seldom possess individual characters such as is manifest among oaks and elms, but the California forests are so made up of a greater number of distinct species than any other in the world, and in them we find not only a marked differentiation into special groups, but also a marked individuality in almost every tree, giving rise to storm effects indescribably glorious. Toward midday, after a long tingling scramble through copses of hazel and canothus, I gained the summit of the highest ridge in the neighborhood, and then it occurred to me that it would be a fine thing to climb one of the trees to obtain a wider outlook and get my ear close to the alien music of its topmost needles. But under circumstances, the choice of a tree was a serious matter. One whose step was not very strong seemed to be in danger of being blown down or by being struck by others in case they would fall. Others were branchless to a considerable height above the ground, and at the same time too large to be grasped with arms and legs in climbing, while others were not favorably situated for clear skies. After cautiously casting about, I made the choice of the tallest of a group of Douglas spruces. They were growing close together like a tuft of grass, so no one of which seemed likely to fall unless all the rest fell with it. Though comparatively long, they were about 100 feet in height, and their lithe, bushy tops were rocking and swirling in wild ecstasy. Being accustomed to climb trees and making botanical studies, I experienced no difficulty in swirling on the top of this one, and never before did I enjoy so noble exhilaration of motion. The slender tops fairly flapped and swished in the passionate torrent, bending and swirling backward and forward, round and round, tracing indescribable combinations of vertical and horizontal curves while clung with muscles from embraced like a bobolink on a reed. And its wild this sweeps my treetop described an arc of from 20 to 30 degrees, but I felt sure of its elastic temper, having seen others of the same species still more severely tied, bent almost to the ground indeed in heavy snows without breaking a fiber. I was therefore safe and free to take the wind into my pulses and enjoy the excited forest from my superb outlook. The view from here must be extremely beautiful in any weather. Now my eye roved over the piney hills and dales as over fields of waving grain, and felt the light running in rippled and broad swelling undulations across the valleys from ridge to ridge as the shining foliage was stirred by corresponding waves of air. Oftentimes these waves of reflected light would break up suddenly into a kind of beaten foam, and again, after chasing one another in regular order, they would seem to bend forward in concentric curves and disappear on some hillside. Like sea waves on a shelving shore, the quality of light reflected from the bent needles was so great as to make whole groves appear as if covered with snow, while the black shadows beneath the trees greatly enhanced the effect of the silvery splendor. Excepting only the shadows, there was nothing somber in all this wild sea of pines. On the contrary, notwithstanding, this was the winter season, the colors were remarkably beautiful. The shafts of the pine and Liberticus were brown and purple, and most of the foliage was well tinged with the yellow. The laurel groves, with the pale underside of their leaves turned upward, made masses of gray, and the end there were many a dash of chocolate color from clumps of manzanita, and a jet of vivid crimson from the bark of the mandaros, while the ground on the hillside, appearing here and there throughout the openings between the groves, displayed masses of pale purple and brown. The sounds of the storm corresponded gloriously with the wild exuberance of light and motion. The profound bass of the naked branches and boles blooming like waterfalls, the quick, tense vibrations of the pine needles, now rising to a shrill whistling hiss, now falling to a silky murmur, the rustling of laurel groves in the dells, and the keen metallic click on leaf. All this was heard in easy analysis when the attention was calmly bent. The very gestures of the multitude were seen to find advantage, so that one could recognize the different species at a different distance of several miles by this means alone, as well as by their forms and colors, and the way they reflected the light. All seemed strong and comfortable, as if really enjoying the storm, while responding to its most enthusiastic greetings. We hear much nowadays concerning the universal struggle for existence, but no struggle is in the common meaning of the word can manifest here. No recognition, danger by any tree, no depreciation, but rather an invincible gladness as remote from exultation as from fear. I kept my lofty perch for hours, frequently closing my eyes to enjoy the music by itself or to feast quietly on the delicious fragrance that was streaming past. The fragrances of the woods was less marked than that produced during warm rain, when so many balsamic buds and leaves were steeped like tea, but from the chafing of resiny branches after each other, and the incessant attrition of myriads of needles in the gale was spiced to a very tonic degree. And besides the fragrance from these local sources, there were traces of scents brought from the afar. From this wind came first from the sea, rubbing against its fresh, spiny waves, then distilled through the redwoods, threading rich, ferny gulches, and spreading itself in broad, undulating currents over many a flower-enameled ridge of the coast mountains, and then across the golden pines up to the purple foothill, and into the piney woods that with these varied incense gathered by the way. Winds are advertisements of all they touch, however much or little they may be able to read them, telling their wanderings even by sense alone. Mariners detect flowery perfume of the land winds afar at sea, and sea winds carry the fragrance of dulse and tangle far inland, where it is quickly recognized, though mingled with the scents of 1,000 land flowers, and it's an illustration of this. I may tell here that I breathed sea air on the Firth and Forth in Scotland while a boy there and was taken to Wisconsin, where I remained 19 years. Then, without, and all this time having breathed one breath of the sea, I walked quietly alone from the middle of the Mississippi Valley to the Gulf of Mexico on botanical excursion. While in Florida, far from the coast, my attention wholly bent on the splendid tropical vegetation about me, I suddenly recognized a sea breeze as it came stiffening through the palmettos and blooming vine tangles, which at once awakened and set free from 1,000 dormant associations and made me a boy again in the Scotland, as if all the intervening years had been annihilated. Most people like to look at mountain rivers and bear them in mind, but few care to look at the winds. Though far from beautiful and sublime, and though they became at times about as visible as flowing water, when the north winds in winter are making upward sweeps over the curving summits of the High Sierra, the fact is sometimes published with flying snow banners a mile long. Those portions of the winds thus embodied can scarce be wholly invisible even to the darkest imagination, and when we look over an agitated forest, we may see something of the wind that stirs it by its effects upon the trees. Yonder it describes in a rush of water like ripples and sweeps over the bending pines from hill to hill. Nearer we see detached plumes and leaves, now spreading by on the level currents, now whirling in eddies, or escaping over the edges of the whirls, soaring aloft on the grand, upswelling domes of air, or tossing on flame-like crests. Smooth, deep currents, cascades, falls, and swirling eddies swing around every tree and leaf, and over all the varied topography of the region, with telling changes of form like mountain rivers conforming to the features of their channels. After tracing the Sierra streams from their fountains to the plains, making where they bloom white and fall, glide in crystal plumes, surge gray and foam-filled, boulder gouged choked gorges, and slip through the winds and long tranquil reaches. After thus learning their language and forms in detail, we may at length hear them chanting all together in one grand anthem, and comprehend them all in clear inner visions, covering the range like lace. But even this spectacle is far from sublime, and not a whit more substantial than what we may behold on the storm streams of air in the mountain woods. We all travel the Milky Way together, trees and men, but it never occurred to me until this storm day, while swinging in the wind, that the trees are travelers in the ordinary sense. They make many journeys, not extensive ones, it is true, but our own little journeys, away and back again. are only little more than tree wavings. Many of them not so much. When the storm begins to abate, I dismounted and sauntered down through the calming woods. The storm tones died away, and turning toward the east, I beheld the countless hosts of the forest hushed and tranquil, towering above one another on the slopes of the hills like a devout audience. The setting sun filled them with amber light, and seemed to say while they listened, "My peace I give unto you." As I gazed onto the impressive scene, all the so-called ruin of the storm was forgotten, and never before did these noble woods appear so fresh, so joyous, so immortal.